In this video, you're going to learn about one of the fundamental principles of worship leading, and that is context. I'll explain more in a second, coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com. This is the place where we talk about how to lead yourself well, lead your church well, and lead worship well. So if you're interested in that, click subscribe down below and let's get into it, because today we are talking about a fundamental principle of worship leading. This has been the bedrock of my worship leading for as long as I've thought about it. I was going to say 15 years, but I had no idea about it for probably the first 10 years of me leading worship. And that principle is this: context. It's context, remembering the context in which we lead. And I'm going to explain more about that over this video, but essentially context is this. It's knowing the church that you're serving in and using that to shape the way that you lead them. We don't lead worship in a vacuum, and I think this is what some people do sort of sometimes whenever they gather all of these online resources, whenever you are part of 1,000 worship leading Facebook groups, and you see this constant stream of new ideas and information coming to you, and you see people with very strong opinions about how things should be done, and you think, well, that their worship ministry is thriving, or at least it seems that way online, and so I just need to take whatever they're telling me and implement it into my worship ministry, and everything will be great and it'll all be fixed. But the piece that's missing in that conversation is context. We can't just take something that we read online, and I'm talking about myself here too, like you can't just take, for the most part, something that I tell you and just plug it into your worship ministry, although I try to keep things pretty simple, but there needs to be another step in there, and that is understanding the context of your church. I don't know the context of your church. Only you know the context that you're leading in, and so you need to see things through the eyes of that context and adapt whatever you see online, whether it's from me or from anybody else. You need to adapt that into the context of your worship ministry. So I'm going to be explaining that a little bit more here as I go through this video. But before we get into that, I want you to start thinking about the context of your church. I want you to take a moment, pause this video, and answer this question. How would you describe the people of your church as a collective? How would you describe the people of your church? What's your community? What's the context that you lead in? And that's going to play into the rest of this conversation that we have. So how would you describe the people of your church in a few sentences? Are they teachers? Are they farmers? Do you serve in a city? Do you serve in a rural setting? Whatever it is, you serve in a specific context. So just go through that thought process. Let us know down in the comments below, and I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks so much for sharing. Now, hopefully you have at least an introductory understanding of what the context is that you serve in. Let's take a look at how that impacts what we do in our worship ministry. The first thing that context plays into is that we've got to know what we're doing in our worship ministry, and more importantly, why we're doing this. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this video. I think oftentimes we have a lot of whats that we know. We know what we're doing. We know what the idea is that we read online or that we just came up with for ourselves, but we also have to know why we're doing it, and that's the context piece. We have to know why we're going to switch around the order of our service. We have to know why we're going to put something on our stage that wasn't there previously, like a stage design or something. Like, what's your purpose of doing it? And does it make sense in the context that you're leading in? I just always think of Mosaic Church, and they're like this really hip church. If you don't know, like the worship leaders wear like overalls and stuff. I guess that's hip. I don't know. Their fashion is beyond me. But I just always think of how if I came in to my church, which is like a rural church, and I was dressed the way that they dress, then I would be oblivious to the context that I'm leading in, because that's not the context that I lead in. Now, that's not to say that what they do is inauthentic. That's the context that they lead in. If I walked in a flannel and some jeans, like, I might be out of place in their church. So we have to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the why is because we want to serve the people of our church well. We want to lead into the context that is their lives, because that will connect with them. We want to connect with people so that we can direct them to God. Connect with people so we can direct them to God. I feel like there's a pithy saying in there I need. Connect to direct. I feel like if I was a preacher, I would put that up on the TV screen beside me. We must connect to direct. Connect with people so that we can direct them to God. And to connect with people, we have to understand the context. So know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Now let's talk about a few specific examples of how that plays out in your worship ministry. One of the biggest ways that context, I think, plays into our worship leading is our song choice. I think this is the most obvious, because we want to pick songs that, number one, are a style that will connect with our people. This is why we don't do like heavy metal screamo songs in church, because that's not going to connect with most of the people in our church. Or maybe it will. Maybe you serve in like a church where that would make sense. Then go for it, if that's how you're going to best serve the people in your church. I don't know the context of your church, so there I go again. But we want to pick songs that, number one, are a style that makes sense in our church. Not that we can't go outside of those styles and try some different things as well, but for the most part, I think we know what style works in our church. So that could even be something like, to go back to the foundational battle in worship, is like traditional versus contemporary. If you serve in a traditional church and everybody in your church loves hymns, then you should probably just do hymns, unless you have a bigger vision for your church and you're trying to reach people outside of your church in a different demographic. But if you are solely looking to serve the people in your church and they all want hymns, then you'd sing hymns, right? That's what we do to serve the people of our church. Conversely, if you've got no people in your church who want to sing hymns, and you do hymns every single Sunday and that's all you ever do, you're not leading into the context of the church. So there's a sense of this that has to do with genre whenever it comes to worship songs. But even beyond that, I think, is understanding the context that you're leading in to help form what songs you sing, what actual messages through the songs that you are allowing your people to worship through. And the context that we need to know in that case is what's going on in the lives of the people of our church, and how am I going to point them to a truth of God that they need to hear in that specific situation that they're in, and how is this song going to allow them to respond to that? That's what context means whenever it comes to song choice. What's going on in the lives of the people of my church, or just my church in general? Maybe you've got some big initiative going on at your church right now. Then you pick songs that lead into that context. This is fundamental for worship leading. If you want to improve your worship leading, that's how you do it. And I talk about this all the time, but get to know the people of your church and then give them what they need in the specific season of life that they're in. That seems obvious, I think, whenever I say it out loud, but it's not been obvious to me for the past, 7-10 years whenever I led worship, like for the first 7 or 10 years that I led worship. So maybe it's not obvious to you. So do that. Get to know the people of your church and give them what they need when it comes to song choices. let's move on to the next way that you can use context in your worship ministry. The next way that you can use context in your worship ministry, and it really relates to song choice, is when it comes to speaking transitions. Because just like we pick songs that allow people to respond to the specific things that are happening in their lives, speaking transitions become so much easier when we know the context that we're speaking into. And this is why I try to stay away. Oftentimes I've thought about, and I still might do this in the future and just clarify it a little bit more, but oftentimes I've thought about just giving worship speaking transitions to you guys and writing up, here's 5 worship speaking transitions you could use this Sunday. And I think there's something to that, but we're not just speaking into a void. We aren't just speaking into a vacuum. You have a specific group of people in your church that you're leading, not just through songs, but also through speaking transitions. So this is really where you make that connection for them, because songs, unless you've written them yourself for your church, they are going to be sort of general. But whenever you use your speaking transitions, you can wrap those, you can put skin on the generality of those songs and help people see how that song fits into the specific season of life that they're in, the specific situation that they're going through, or the thing that they need to celebrate. That's what speaking transitions need to do. So I've shared this before, but how do you craft a speaking transition? What's going on in the lives of the people of my church? What truth of God do they need to hear? And then how am I going to lead them in responding to that? That's how you craft a speaking transition. You answer those 3 questions. And that all has to do with the context that you're leading in. What's the context of the lives of the people of your church? So speaking transitions, context, are so integrated. Let's move on to the final point. And finally, I just want to hit again on this idea of your community, because I think it's really important. All right, your community is your community. Your church is your church. You know it best. And so that's why it doesn't work to take things from outside of your church and just throw them into the pile of what's ever going on in your worship ministry. There needs to be that filter in between there, so that when we implement something, the people of our church, it makes sense for them. And it's not just taken from some other ministry. There has to be a filter in between, because your community is different than the community across the country. Your church is different than the church that's down the street, and not in a better or worse way. That's just how it is. These group of people have congregated for a reason, and probably some of those reasons has to do with similarities that they have. Obviously, the main one being that we believe in Jesus. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. For example, this church that I'm at, they all are in this rural environment, right? So they've congregated for that. They share a specific set of values. At my last church, there were a lot of teachers there, I guess, would be the context that I was leading in. And it was more in the downtown area of the city, town where I live. So even that, there's an example of how I've had to switch the context that I lead in, or switch my understanding of what context I'm leading in, and how that's affected how I lead worship, because I understand the community that I'm serving. So you must understand your community. And that's why I wanted you to do that exercise at the beginning of this video. Think about, who are the people in my church? What is the commonality between them? And if you don't know, maybe look at another church and think, how are they different than my church? And that might help you see the similarities in your own church. So recognize and understand what community you're leading in, what context you're leading in when you lead on a Sunday morning. So all of that to say, know the context of your church. Know what you're leading into. know the people of your church so that you can pick songs that serve them well, so that you can speak in between songs and highlight truths that they need to hear, and so that when you implement something into your ministry, you don't just know the what of it, but you know the why and the how you're going to do it so that it's going to serve the people of your church well. Now, all of that talk of context, there is something that I think that you can just plug into your worship ministry and it will work. And that is the worship rehearsal blueprint that I put together. It's linked down in the description below. I think that you can just take this. It's a step-by-step guide to having the perfect worship rehearsal, the best worship rehearsal you've ever had that leads your team well, not just musically, not just running through songs, but spiritually and relationally as well, so that they can grow in their faith and strengthen the unity of your team. So check that out in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.